Noah's flood. Was it local or was it global? Is the Genesis account the original, or are the ancient Near Eastern versions, are they the original? In today's video, we're going to take a look at that. Christ is king. Let's get stuck into it. So one of the most common objections you will encounter when you are defending the reliability of Genesis is the flood narrative. The argument always goes something along these lines. The story of Noah and the flood is not original to the Bible. It is borrowed from older Mesopotamian myths like the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis epic, which means that Genesis is nothing more than ancient Near Eastern mythology, and we really shouldn't take it as seriously as we do. That's often the argument that gets put our way. Now, it's normally coming from those outside the Christian worldview. But funnily enough, you actually do get some within the Christian worldview that argues that the Genesis account, the story of the flood, is not actually original, but it's the biblical worldview, the biblical explanation of what happened across multiple cultures. Now, the interesting thing is that this did happen across multiple cultures. So we have to ask the question, and it's the question that always gets brought up: was the float local or was it global? The idea that the Genesis account is not original, that is nothing more than ancient Near Eastern myth, and is similar to the Epic of Gilgamesh and all those others that you can think of. It gets repeated so often, especially in university classrooms. You hear it in online discussions and on TikTok and all these debate panels. You find it in popular level books that are written on religion, or deconstructionists who talk about it just being another fairy tale. And for a lot of Christians, it has caused a genuine crisis of faith. Because a lot of Christians often aren't prepared to answer stuff like this. So what we're going to be doing in today's video is we're going to be taking a look at all of it, discussing it, and hopefully sticking very close to the source material. The Atrahasis epic is the oldest of the major Mesopotamian flood texts, with the most complete version dating to around 1700 BC, though it does draw on earlier traditions. It tells the story of the gods creating humanity to perform labour for them. You've got the noise of humanity that is disturbing the gods' sleep. Funny, the gods needing sleep. You've got various plagues sent to reduce the human population, and finally, a flood sent by the god Enlil to destroy humanity entirely. The god Enki warns a man named Atrahasis, instructs him to build a boat, and humanity is preserved. After the flood, the gods are hungry because there is no one to provide sacrifices, and they gather like flies around the offerings that Atrahasis makes. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains a flood narrative in its 11th tablet that is the closest parallel to the Genesis account. The flood hero here is Utnapishtim, warned by the god Ea to build a boat and take aboard all living creatures. The flood lasts 7 days, birds are sent out to find land, and Utnapishtim offers sacrifice after the flood. The gods again gather like flies around the sacrifice because they have been deprived of offerings during the flood. So note here you've got gods that are sleepy and hungry and cranky. Not exactly god-like material. But the interesting thing is the similarities between these texts and Genesis are 100% very, very closely knit, but they're also very, very different. And they deserve somewhat of a look at. Because in these traditions, you've got the flood being of divine origin, a single man was warned in advance, a boat was built to preserve life, animals are taken aboard, birds are sent out to find land, and sacrifice was offered after the flood. These parallels are close enough that the relationship between these traditions cannot just be glibly dismissed. I can't just as a Christian say those other stories, nothing to them. But nor can someone take my narrative, the Christian worldview, and dismiss it either with a knee-jerk response of pretending, that these parallels don't exist and that they don't obviously point to something that they all hold in common. The borrowing argument focuses almost entirely on the similarities and consistently downplays the differences, which there are multiple differences, but this is something that the skeptic won't often tell people. They like to play into all these similarities and go, see, these stories are all borrowed from one another. But they either don't know, they either downplay the theological or the historical differences. Because when you bring them into the picture, the whole thing changes, the analysis changes. The most fundamental difference is the theological one, and it runs through every aspect of the narratives. In the Mesopotamian traditions, the flood is sent because humanity is too noisy and is disturbing the gods' sleep. The motivation is divine irritation. It's not. The so-called gods are divinely irritated because the noisy humans won't let them sleep. Compare that with the biblical account, where it is moral judgment being passed because the condition of the humans has become so evil in their heart that all they are doing is moral wrongs and rejecting the image of God that they were made in. So one, you've got divine irritability, and in the other, you have got a good, just God judging moral evil. After the flood, these gods all gather around the sacrifice like they are hungry animals. Why? Because in these stories, the gods eat. They need sustenance. They depend on human offerings for their sustenance. You compare that with a theological worldview of Genesis, it's completely different. The flood is brought on by a moral judgment from God, judging human wickedness, where God's character is consistent and and just throughout, where Noah is preserved because of his righteousness rather than because of a divine patron's favoritism where he was just warned in advance, and where God establishes a covenant after the flood that reflects his ongoing moral commitment to his creation. And before someone comes in and says, oh, but even in the biblical narrative there was a sacrifice made to your God, my God did not feast upon it. He is not in need of food. The sacrifice was an offering of thanksgiving, thanking the Lord for bringing Noah and his family through the flood, for sparing them, for sparing the animals. So it's not even remotely comparable. The ethical framework of Genesis is not a variation on the Mesopotamian theme. It is completely different understanding of what God is, what humanity is, what sin is, and what justice requires. The God of Genesis is not worried about being disturbed or about him going hungry. He is responding to a genuine moral corruption with the judgment that is proportionate and purposeful. And he preserves Noah, not because Noah is a divine friend of God, no, but because Noah walked with God. Noah was righteous in God's sight. Pair that with these Mesopotamian versions where the gods just arbitrarily are like, oh yeah, just warn that man. They represent a fundamentally different theological vision, and the narrative structure shows that. So in Genesis, the covenant that follows the flood has no parallel in the Mesopotamian text. But in Genesis, God commits himself to the preservation of the creation and establishes the rainbow as a sign of that commitment. That's not any type of mythology. You can call it whatever you want, but mythology it is not. What you're seeing in action is a God bringing about a covenant between him and his people, where he binds himself to his people, of God's relationship with his creation. And all of this anticipates the subsequent covenants with Abraham, with Moses and David, and ultimately into the new covenant. Flood in Genesis then is not some sort of isolated mythological episode. Also, whenever you look at this, the moral characterization of the flood hero is also significantly different in each of these stories. In the Genesis account, Noah is described as a righteous man, blameless in his generation, who walk with God. Atrahasis and Utnapishtim are preserved because they have a divine patron who happens to warn them, not because of any moral quality in them, but just because the gods deem it so. Genesis account though, but it is interested in the moral character of the flood survivor, or survivors if you count his family, in a way that the Mesopotamian texts simply do not care about, and don't record. Because the Genesis account is part of a narrative about God's moral relationship with humanity. If the similarities require explanation and the differences are as significant as I just described, and there's a lot more I can go into, but I don't want these videos being super long. They're all near an hour at the moment and no one wants to stick around for that. But what is the actual relationship between the Genesis flood narrative and the Mesopotamian flood traditions? Well, three basic positions have been developed throughout scholarship. The first is the dependence hypothesis, which holds that the Genesis flood narrative is derived from and dependent on the Mesopotamian traditions, that the biblical writers borrowed from the flood story from the Mesopotamian sources and adapted it to fit their theological purposes. This is the position that underlines the popular argument in scholarship. It requires the Genesis account to be relatively late, to be composed after significant Israelite contact with Mesopotamian culture, and it treats the differences between Genesis and the Mesopotamian texts as editorial modifications rather than an independent tradition. The second is the common source hypothesis, which holds that both the Genesis account and the Mesopotamian traditions draw on a cultural common historical memory of an actual catastrophic event that was preserved differently in different cultural and religious traditions as it would have been passed down from the actual survivors of the ark. So Noah and his family, by the time they repopulate the earth and spread out, these traditions that get further away from the family's telling of it gets twisted, it gets changed, and it gets adopted into different cultural and religious traditions. On this view, neither tradition borrowed from the other, but they all reflect in their different ways the very real event of Noah's flood. Researchers like Andrew Collins and John Walton, who is a biblical scholar, who hold to this view. Now, I hold to this view partially. I think there is truth to it. But the third position, and it's held by several evangelical Old Testament scholars, including Kenneth Kitchen, John Current, and it is the direction of dependence actually runs the other way. The Mesopotamian traditions are distortions of the original historical event that is preserved most faithfully in the Genesis account. If you just heard the second point and you think this sounds familiar, there's a reason. There's a very distinct difference. In the second one, the accounts run both ways. I give you my take of why I hold to it partially, and this is why I hold to it partially, because I hold to the third theory. This theory that says that the Genesis account is the one where is the original and these other accounts distort it. This says that the theological cruelty of the Mesopotamian versions reflects the deterioration of our original tradition rather than the primitive source from, which a more sophisticated biblical version was derived. Kitchen's argument actually draws on the general pattern in ancient Near Eastern literature, where simplified and theologically less developed versions tend to be later rather than earlier, and where the polytheistic elaboration of what may have originally been monotheistic changed into polytheistic, so God becomes the gods. Now, if we're being honest, to look at any of these positions, we have to acknowledge that there is a relationship between the traditions. It is genuinely debated among serious scholars, and that the popular claim that Genesis is simply borrowed from Gilgamesh or any of the others is more considerably contested than critics would like to admit. I guarantee you there will be people in the comment section that are like, your flood story is borrowed from another narrative. Please show me how you would demonstrate that, because you can't. The scholars can't even demonstrate this. This is why they have got different theories. The question of whether there is any physical evidence for a catastrophic flood in the ancient Near East that could have generated widespread flood traditions is a separate question from the literary relationship between the text, and it has its own interesting body of evidence. Leonard Woolley's excavations at Ur in the 1920s uncovered a substantial layer of water-deposited sediment between the two occupation layers, which Woolley interpreted as evidence of a catastrophic local flood. Similar flood sediment layers have been found at other ancient Mesopotamian sites, including Kish and Surapak. These layers do not represent a single simultaneous global event, but they do indicate that catastrophic flooding was a real feature of Mesopotamian history, and that the memory of such events would have been preserved in the traditions of the people who experienced them. Ryan and Pittman's 1997 hypothesis, developed in their book Noah's Flood, proposed that the filling of the Black Sea basin around 5600 BC, when the Mediterranean waters broke through and is now the Bosphorus Strait, and rapidly flooded a large freshwater lake, represents the historical event underlying the flood traditions. The flooding of the Black Sea basin was a genuine catastrophic catastrophic event that would have displaced large populations around its shores, and that could have generated flood memories across a wide area. The hypothesis has been debated and modified since its publication, but the underlying geological evidence for a catastrophic Black Sea flooding event is well established, even if its connection to the biblical flood traditions remains speculative. The question of whether Genesis' flood was global or regional is a theological and exegetical question, one that this video will not be able to resolve, nor am I going to get into right now because I plan on doing another video on it. Christians do and can hold a wide range of positions on it. I personally hold to it being a global flood. What the archaeological and geological evidence does is establish that catastrophic flooding was a real feature of the ancient Near Eastern world, and that the preservation of flood traditions across multiple cultures reflects genuine historical memory. One of the most important contributions of the recent Old Testament scholarship to the flood narrative is the recognition that Genesis is doing something very specific and polemical in its use of flood tradition material. And that understanding what it is doing changes how the similarities with the Mesopotamian text should be read. John Walton of Wheaton College has argued extensively that the ancient Near Eastern text, including Genesis, need to be read within their own cultural and literary context rather than through modern Western expectations about what historical narrative looks like. On Walton's reading, the similarities between Genesis and the Mesopotamian flood texts are not evidence of borrowing, but evidence that both traditions are engaging in the same cultural and literary conventions to make very different theological points. Genesis is not trying to do what modern historical narrative does. It is using the conventions of ancient Near Eastern literature to make theological claims about the nature of God, humanity, sin, and covenant. These are radically different from anything that is expressed in the Mesopotamian traditions. Chris Wolke and others have pointed out that the Genesis flood narrative functions within the larger context of Genesis 1 through 11 as a decreation and recreation narrative. The waters of the flood echoes the waters of Genesis in Genesis chapter 1 before the creation of dry land. Noah's emergence from the ark parallels the creation of humanity. God's covenant with Noah after the flood parallels his blessing of humanity at creation. So the flood is not simply a judgment story, but it is a theological statement about the nature of sin, the justice of God, and the possibility of new beginning within the covenant relationship that God initiates with his creation. Now, when you look at it with that theological architecture, it has no parallel in the Mesopotamian traditions, regardless of any surface similarities in the narrative. The flood narrative objection always comes up, and there's always two different approaches. The first is the academic or the semi-academic context, where someone has encountered the Gilgamesh parallel and is presenting it as if it settles the question of whether Genesis borrowed from it or whether Gilgamesh was borrowed from Genesis, and it's a question about Genesis' historical reliability. The second is the pastoral context, where a Christian, often a younger believer or a student, or someone very new to the faith, has encountered the objection and is genuinely unsettled by it. In the academic context, the response is to press on the differences rather than conceding the similarities as if they make up or complete the whole story. Because the similarities are very real, but the differences are also equally real and considerably more significant. To the question of what Genesis is claiming and whether those claims are distinctive or not, the theological vision of Genesis is not derivable from the Mesopotamian traditions by any process of simple editing or even theological gymnastics. It represents a fundamentally different understanding of God and humanity, and it stands in complete implicit polemic against the polytheistic framework of the surrounding cultures of the near ancient Middle East. Now, move that to the pastoral context. The most important thing to establish is that the existence of the parallel flood traditions across the near ancient Eastern cultures is itself consistent with the historical memory of an actual flood event. That the differences between Genesis and the Mesopotamian texts or traditions are not embarrassments. In fact, they actually complement each other in a way where they clearly talk about a global flood. The fact that multiple ancient cultures have remembered and carried down a catastrophic flood story is evidence not against Genesis, but is actually something that would back up Genesis. It is precisely what you would expect if such an event occurred and left an impression across multiple human communities. The flood narrative is not an embarrassment for Christians, and for those that have done the work into actually understanding it, to understand all the research behind it, to see the difference of opinions that Christians can and do have, and to understand ultimately that whenever you look at the actual Mesopotamian text and you look at Genesis, this is not an embarrassment to the Christian tradition. If anything, it helps support our position. The skeptic's not going to like that, but it's the simple matter of fact. What we have whenever we understand and when we look at these texts, we can stand firm on the historical narrative of Genesis while recognizing that Genesis is not seeking to be a historical narrative in the way that we would present history today. It is seeking to do something in its literary function that would have been evident to its earliest readers. It is showing the decreation, recreation understanding of the creation story that shows God as being a just God who is in covenant with his people. That is ultimately what we are looking at in Genesis. So the flood narrative, I hope you enjoyed it. We'll get into further debates on this in the future, I'm sure. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Please do like, share, and subscribe. Ultimately, Christ is King. I'll see you in the next one.
Please like, share, and subscribe to the Layman Apologist to support my treat fund.